today have really accelerated things in many ways to what I guess many people were thinking. And yes, there's still more details that are to come. But for all of us in the active recreation and sport areas, this topic today around the health and safety implications of getting sport up and running and recreation up and running is just going to be more and more prevalent. And again, we're absolutely rapt to have Richard Gordon here from Gibson Sheat and to join us and take us through a really sort of an informative seminar around some of the things that we need to be aware of. There's a number of questions that have been posed leading into the discussion as well that he will cover. And yeah, we're looking forward to it. We really encourage you guys to answer as much questions as you can because it's a big area. It's something that's so important, I think, as we do start to open up our fields, our facilities, the implications across those sorts of things that are happening, utilising our volunteer workforce. We've got contact tracing and that sort of thing happening. So yeah, it's a massive area of learning for everybody. So welcome, Richard. It's great to have you on board again. And yeah, we'll let you get into it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mark. I'm just going to share my screen here so we can all go through my PowerPoint presentation. Excellent. Hopefully you can all see that now. Look, thank you again to Mark and everyone at Sport Wellington for putting the series of webinars on. I think it's a great initiative, especially as Mark says, we're moving into a fairly grey area where there is a lot of questions and often there aren't all the answers immediately. And I think we saw a bit of that yesterday with Sport New Zealand releasing their helpful guidelines around getting back to recreation and sport at level 2. While there's a lot of information in there about how it's going to look like, there are still some gaps, which I hope to go through in this webinar today. But promisingly, we do get sport and recreation under level 2. I'm sure everyone here is extremely excited about that. I know I am. I've been going a little bit crazy on Saturday afternoons, wondering what to do with myself. So the sooner we get out there, the better. But there will be a bit of admin really to work through before each sport can restart. Now, I went over a lot of law last week, especially around employments and how that affects sporting organisations. I'm not proposing to do much of that again this week. I believe the recording is on Sport Wellington's website for those who want to go and have a look at that. This session is more practical guidance around how we're going to restart our sports safely and following the guidelines. I should put a proviso on from the start that this doesn't replace specific guidance for specific sports. This is more of a general, what's it going to look like, what an organisation is going to have to do. It'll be up to each specific organisation and sport to work through their individual and unique issues that there'll be. I hope to cover as much as I can from a more general point of view, but I thought I should put that proviso on at the start. Now, look, I have to do a little bit of law to start. Sorry about this, and a lot of it might be familiar with organisations, but really the obligations for restarting sport under level 2 are going to flow, legal obligations at least, will flow from the Health and Safety at Work Act. And so all we've heard about contact tracing and distancing and good hygiene practices, these are all obligations that will flow from the Health and Safety at Work Act. So I'll start with the Act, and hopefully I can run through it pretty quickly before we get to practical guidance, but I think it would be helpful to go over the Act and how it applies to organisations and individuals before we get to the practical guidance. So the Act, the new Act that came in 2015, changes the focus from monitoring and recording health and safety incidents to proactively identifying and managing risks. So it's a bit more of the fence at the top of the cliff rather than the ambulance at the bottom. It sets out the principal duties and rights in relation to workplace health and safety, and that also includes the sporting sector. And that the guiding principle is that workers and others need to be the highest level of protection from health and safety risks so far as is reasonably practical. Now, I'll talk about that last sentence a bit later, so far as is reasonably practical, because that's quite important. it's not necessarily doing everything possible. So the Health and Safety at Work Act applies to anyone conducting a business or undertaking. There's not too much of a difference between those two things. A business is more commercial or profit-making in nature. I would say all of our sporting organisations, or almost all of our sporting organisations, will fit under that definition. Purely voluntary organisations may be exempt. It would still be in their best interests to practice proper health and safety. So the Act places the primary duty of care for workers and others on the organisation involved. And if there are more than one organisations involved in running an event or an activity, for example, an owner of a facility and then a different organisation running sport within that facility, there are obligations on both parties to ensure that anyone participating or otherwise involved in any capacity are safe. It focuses on managing risks. It requires organisations to engage with other organisations and with staff and with anyone that's going to be involved, and it has clearly defined responsibilities. So I won't bore you with the law part of that. I'm happy to answer questions either later or separately on that. I think number 4 there is going to be of most interest to people here, is how do we achieve the obligations under the Act, given level 2 and our goal to restart sport quickly. So the key part of the Act is all about risk and identifying and then managing that risk. And this is an ongoing process. So the first step, and I imagine a lot of organisations have done this for many years regarding their own sport and their own events, but the first step is to identify and assess risks, and then minimise or eliminate those risks, and then review your process and constantly review to ensure that where possible we are managing and minimising those risks. Now that can often look like a risk chart. Giving you an example here, where once the risks are identified, they're classified as to what level of risk the incident is. So you can see from the chart there, on one side we've got probability of the risk happening, and then on the top we've got the impact if the risk follows through. So if we use an earthquake, the probability is, depending on where you are in New Zealand, goes from unlikely to likely, and the impact can be quite high. So that would just be one example. And then once you've identified and assessed the risks involved, you move to minimising or eliminating that. So here's a table I've drawn up. On the left, you've got an example of the risk. So whatever risk you've identified there, you've assessed it as low. And then how you're going to minimise or eliminate it would be a bullet point of actions being taken to minimise the risk. And then on the end, we've got a contingency plan. So what the organisation would do if the risk happens. This is best practice. I would really recommend everyone has this for all aspects of their organisation and running events. It's certainly a very helpful document to have, and I'd hope that everyone has at least a health and safety officer, if not a committee, to run through things like this. And going forward, I think with starting sport in level 2, having something like this is going to be incredibly helpful, and a good backstop if an incident does happen and questions are then asked about how things have happened. If an organisation can show, yep, we assessed the risk, here's what we did to minimise it, then that's going to look really good for them. If something happens and there's no plan in place around minimising risks, that's not going to look good from a legal or from a publicity point of view. Now, I haven't been specific about coronavirus and level 2. Yes, I'm just running through all of this. So a risk chart, I'd suggest there's one for your office. There's one for any facilities that you either own or regularly go to, and then one for events that you host or run. You could even have one for working from home, which I'm sure a lot of us have been doing. I know our firm Gibson Sheats has gone over that and has one working from home, and it's something that should always be reviewed. So checking with staff periodically around, are there any additional risks that you've noticed, that kind of stuff, especially when staff are working from home. So let's get a bit more into the nitty-gritty, the fun part of today's webinar. How do we resume sports and active recreation under level 2 while following the necessary health guidelines? So I thought I'd start by discussing what the risks associated with sport and COVID-19 are. And I think it's quite simple. There's only one risk: somebody or multiple people catching COVID-19 at your office or sports facility or sporting ground. I see that as the only risk, and anything else kind of flows from that. So if we are looking at mitigating that risk, it's simply reducing the chances that somebody can catch COVID-19 at your office, at your sporting facility, or at your game, essentially. Now, I'd note that how these risks are mitigated will be very sports specific, and that NSOs, National Sporting Organisations, will be releasing individual sports guidelines around this, and they're being developed at the moment. So this webinar does not replace that guidance, and that should be every sport's primary port of call. But hopefully we can run through and we can get a bit of a head start on what organisations will need to do today. Secondly, the mitigation for risk will be location specific. For example, a squash club generally only has 1 or 2 entrances. It would be quite easy in that particular circumstance to do contact tracing. Then it would be, for example, Kilbirnie Park, where you can enter from any point around the park. So location is going to be quite crucial. So I'll work through what the requirements are for sport, and then possibly run through some examples of how specific sports might look to mitigate the risk of someone catching COVID at their sport. So what's compulsory for sports under level 2? No gatherings over 100. Now, there's a bit of a grey area here, and that's indoor or outdoor, I should say. There's a bit of a grey area here because they've said gatherings do not include participants. So players, officials, referees for an outdoor sport. So if you have a rugby game, say, the gathering is only the spectators around the field rather than the people on the field itself. So sports are going to have in place some sort of mechanism for ensuring there isn't over 100 people gathering at that location. Now, for some sports, that might be quite easy. For others, it might be fairly difficult. I know, well, thinking of any sport, people are going to want to get out and either play or watch because there hasn't been any sport to watch. So I can imagine this will actually be quite difficult for some sports. And whether or not you have to look at having singular entry points, roping off certain areas around the field to watch the game, some sort of clicker device that you can keep a tally of people that have entered. You will have to have a plan around how you're going to prevent gatherings from going over 100 people. Some sports will have that a lot easier than others. The other interesting thing that this raises, and it wasn't quite dealt with under the Sport New Zealand guidelines yesterday, but that's certainly no criticism of them. They've done a fantastic job of getting that guidance out as soon as they did, is that they've said each specific field. So if we take all courts, so if we take rugby and netball as an example, each field can have a gathering of 100, and if there's another field on the same park, that field can have a gathering of 100. Same with a netball court. They've said a court can have a gathering of 100, and another court very close can also have a gathering. I think we're going to see some movements on that possibly, because where my issue is if you look at Haitaito netball courts or Kilbirnie Park again, where we've got several. Kilbirnie Park's got 3 rugby fields and 1 football field. Haitaito's got a huge number of netball courts. Everyone's going to be using the same bathrooms, and if you have 4 or 5 gatherings of 100, using the same bathrooms, that's falling foul of the no gatherings over 100 situation. There'd have to be some very strict control and sanitisation of those bathrooms. So I think we'll see some movement there, and certainly it's an interesting idea, because further on that, while you could have the gatherings of 100 on the field or the court that don't include the players or officials, as soon as they go into a facility like a club rooms, the same restrictions apply there. So you can't have more than 100 people within the club rooms, regardless of whether they are participants or not. So the changing rooms becomes an issue. And that would suggest to me that you won't be able to have multiple games at one park, in terms of if you went over 100 people using the changing rooms at once or even back to back, there'll be an issue there. So I think you'd see 1 or 2 games at a park rather than multiple. So these are really only issues for the larger sports that have multiple games at one location. But I think we're going to need some more guidance there. But certainly these are issues that organisations should be noting down and planning ahead as to what they can do to help with these. Now, just my overall point when it comes to all of this is every single organisation, every single club, almost every team is going to need a plan around how all of these risks, or the one risk, is mitigated, and how these health guidelines are going to be followed. So I'll be saying that a lot. If you can have a plan ready, and a lot of that plan will flow down from your national sporting organisations, that plan is really crucial. And all of this should be going into your plan that you're developing, as well as all the guidance from Sport New Zealand and the NSOs. So that's the first compulsory guideline for organisations and clubs. Now, the next one is, if you're unwell, stay home. That is the case for anything in New Zealand still. That hasn't changed at all. I think that's pretty hard to manage. Everyone does what they decide to do. However, the only way I could think of managing this is in part of the contact tracing system. And I'll get to that. And it would simply be adding a question on saying, do you feel unwell? And if the answer to that is yes, that person should be directed to go home immediately and not enter the facility or field or office or whatever it is. So that takes me on to the contact tracing system. This is compulsory. Every single sport or organisation will need some way of tracing the contacts of people who have participated in or attended that sport as a spectator. Now, Roger from Sport Wellington has asked me to run through this in a bit of depth. What is a participant? What is a spectator? Given that we want to contact trace as many people as possible, and we want that system to be as robust as possible, I'd say the safest option there is to go as wide as possible with the definition of participant and spectator. So those actually participating in the sport, players or competitors, coaches that are there, team staff, other management, club staff, officials, referees, ball boys, spectators is pretty self-explanatory, but I would be going as wide as possible and capturing as many people as possible in the contact tracing system. Now, I think the contact tracing system could be quite simple in terms of what you actually need to do, and all I would say is be gathering people's full names and a phone number for them. Without further guidance from anyone else, that's all that's needed to track someone down and keep a record of who's there. And I'd simply add on to that list, name, number, do you feel unwell? That's all I'd be getting from people at this stage, although further guidance might come out. Now, this will be easier for some organisations and facilities than others. So if I use a squash facility as an example, people enter the same entrance, they go straight to the desk, and that's where the contact tracing questions happen. It's easy for them. There aren't many other ways people can get into a facility like that, and that applies to a lot. For outdoor sports, rugby, football, hockey, and the others, it's a bit more difficult. It's a bit more location specific. So there are some fields out there and courts out there where it would be easy to contact trace everyone that attends, and you do that at the entrance to the fields. So if I take, let's use Haitaitai, the netball courts. I think there's the netball courts, there's the rugby field there, and there's also a football field up the top at the velodrome. There's only really 2 or 3 entrances into that whole complex. There's the driveway coming off the main road, and you could have someone based there to stop cars and do the contact tracing at that point. The rugby might want to do one on their driveway, and then there's the overbridge, I think, from the other side of the road, and you might want to have someone there. So that's easy when you've got a limited number of entrances to your field. What isn't easy is when you've got a field like Kilburnie Park, or Fraser Park out in the Hut, which is completely open, and anyone can enter from any given point. It's a bit harder to do contact tracing then. Some recommendations that I would make, and national sporting organisations will be more specific about this, but it is food for thought and something to think about now, because the quicker we can all be prepared, the quicker we can get out on the field. So for those fields that are a bit more open, some examples of how you could do efficient contact tracing would be signage and a requirement for everyone to sign in at a specific point. You might want to rope off areas around the field. So if I use a Premier Rugby game as an example, the field is already roped. You could put a second rope around that field where spectators can then stand between the ropes to watch the game, and that area between the ropes is only has 1 or 2 entry points, and they have to go past someone who will take their details. Also, you could have a club official walking around the field or court, taking down everyone's details, maybe once per half or a couple of times during the game. There will be other options as well, but these are some basic examples of what sports could do for contact tracing. But what is important is that contact tracing is compulsory, and that each organisation or sports will need to have this in their plan, and that flows down to the clubs as well, because sport is such a volunteer-based activity. A lot of the contact tracing system will fall actually on the clubs running the sport, or the home club where the sport's being played. And so I would really recommend that all clubs as well have a plan in place around this, and I would hope that the regional sporting organisation is giving guidance to the clubs, and the national sporting organisation is giving the guidance down. We've got that flow down effect there, and that should be coming. So the third or fourth compulsory guideline to restart sport is regular cleaning and sanitisation. Now that's quite wide, and again is a sport specific and location specific guideline. Now for an outdoor sport, say I'll use rugby as an example, there aren't too many things that's shared. There's the ball, and then there's the players themselves, as well as, I guess, the kicking tee and water bottles and things like that. It's really common sense at this point for each sport to have a look at and go, well, what ways can we do this and ensure that there is regular cleaning and sanitisation of areas and materials used for sport. So in rugby, you'd be making sure that the ball is washed before the game, after the game, half time kind of thing, all the balls being used. Other ways you could do this for sports like squash, again, you could minimise or eliminate shared equipment, so a requirement for people to bring their own rackets. And then if there is any kind of shared equipment, it's washed on a regular basis. For all sports, I would say it's fairly clear that people should be sanitizing their hands before and afterwards, as well as at half time where possible. It's just where practicable, taking these sort of steps to make sure that the risks of anyone catching COVID are minimized. So the next where I get to with that is, well, how far do we have to go? Surely we don't have to wash down everything all the time after one person's used it, and go down that route. And that's where I was talking earlier about your obligations under the Act are so far as is reasonably practical. So what does that mean? So practical means possible to be done, and that's quite wide. But reasonably doesn't mean doing everything humanely possible to manage a risk. It's simply, what are other organisations doing, and what would they reasonably do in the same situation? And which is quite good, because it means you don't need to do absolutely everything, as that's unnecessary and would place some fairly restrictive obligations on organisations. However, given what we're facing, I would say the safe option is to do whatever you can within reason. So whether that's regular cleaning of facilities and courts, high contact areas such as door handles and any shared equipment, I would very much recommend having in the plan, we've identified all these high contact areas. Here's what we're doing to regularly clean and sanitize these areas or shared equipment and our facility and premises, and just include that level of detail in your plan. And the more you can do, the better. So that's going to be specific to each sport there. So that's the compulsory side of things. There is a list of recommendations as well. Now, what's recommended is 2 meter distancing still. Now, for some sports, that's very easy. I'm thinking golf. And for others, that's impossible. Contact sports, netball, rugby, hockey, football, they have said that's fine at those sports as long as you are following the other health guidelines. Now, they also recommend that at-risk individuals take additional precautions. Now, what do I mean by at-risk individuals? That could be staff, that could be participants, that could be spectators. They have said that anyone who's at risk, elderly, compromised immune systems, things like that, they can now return to work and venture out, but they still need to take proper precautions. So I'd be having a specific part of the plan that you've got in place around at-risk staff or spectators, and been identifying the risks, which is, it's the same risk, but the possible consequence is higher. It may not be possible in some situations to mitigate right down to a level where both parties, i.e. the at-risk person and the organisation, are comfortable. All I can say in this situation is just to communicate and consult with at-risk people to get to the point where both parties are comfortable. And if there is still disagreement, and this is more around staff and volunteers, WorkSafe can help in these situations. They do offer their help for situations such as this. If I take an organisational point of view, if you've got at-risk staff or volunteers, you could look at further steps for those specific staff. So they could be put in the least customer-facing or role where they have the least personal interaction. And it's going to be specific to every situation. We gave advice to a company where they drove trucks, and so they were an essential service, and they had some at-risk staff. And normally their drivers would share trucks, but what they did for their at-risk staff was they simply said, well, this is your truck for this period. We'll make sure that it's only used by you. And that's just an example of what organisations could do there. And then what else is recommended is minimising shared equipment still, which I've talked about. If you could eliminate that entirely, great. But the recommended guideline is to minimise shared equipment. So what I think you have to think about in your plan there is how does this all apply to my facility or my sports? Where do people touch a lot? Where do people enter my facility or my sport? How do we do all of this specifically at our grounds or locations or fields? Where do people congregate? And that should all go into the plan. And the more detailed your plan is, the more prepared your sports or club or facility is going to be to open and go ahead. Now, what about club rooms? Say after the game, or gyms or pro shops? They can all open. Food and drink can be provided, so long as all the necessary other health guidelines are being met. So, for example, if I take club rooms which are providing food, drink, and food and drink, that follows Jacinda's 3 S's from yesterday's press conference: seated, separated, single server, and less than 100 inside. And then sanitisation and contact tracing there. So for some organisation, I'll use rugby as an example again, you have to do the contact tracing and everything on the field, and then you have to do the same for people that come into the club rooms, as they might not be the same people. So that's something to think about there as well. Now, at the bottom of this page, I've put a link up, which is to that Sport New Zealand's guideline that they released yesterday. If you haven't already, I strongly recommend having a look at that. You can find it on the main page of their website as well, so I wouldn't worry too much about copying the link off here. But those guidelines and guidance are extremely helpful. So, if we move on a little bit, I've been asked to raise this as well. What does this mean for your staff and contractors and volunteers and even participants? So what obligations do these people have? And that's firstly to take reasonable care of their own health and safety, and reasonable care that others aren't harmed by their actions. So if someone knew they were sick or knew they had COVID and wanted to go out to a sports game anyway, they're actually breaching their own obligations there. But that certainly doesn't remove the obligations for organisations and entities to minimise the risk of this happening. They must follow any reasonable health and safety instructions given to them. In this situation, I would think that's the instructions to contact trace and sanitise hands and enter or exit via certain points, all of that kind of stuff. And they must cooperate with any reasonable health and safety policy or procedures. So that's similar there. Now, I've been asked to go over a couple of scenarios as well, which could be quite relevant. First scenario I've got is a council-owned sports centre where multiple sporting organisations run activities. If I could think of an example, that would be the ASB Centre out in Kilburnie, where we've got netball, basketball, volleyball, all sorts of sporting organisations run activities there. Whose responsibility is it to do all of this at a facility like that? And look, the simple answer is there is no one-size-fits-all answer. You can't just rely on the owner or of the building, in this case the council, to take care of all of this and just say, no, it's the council's problem, they own the building. All organisations, the owner, the users of the building, have obligations under the Health and Safety at Work Act. And I would not be saying, well, it's their responsibility, we don't have to do anything. I would really recommend that everyone has a plan. And in this case, when there's a shared facility like that, it's going to be about working together to develop that plan. So it might be the council is really proactive and comes out and goes, right, for everyone who's using this facility, here's the plan we've got in place. Here's what we're going to do for contact tracing and sanitisation and all of that kind of stuff. So, for example, the ASB Centre, there's the main entrance at the front. Facility staff could do all the contact tracing there, hand washing, entry and exit. But it is going to be a team effort here. And certainly you don't want to be the organisation that's dropped the ball and just relied on others to do this for you. So I wouldn't be simply saying, oh no, just because we're using someone else's facility, it means that it's their problem. It's still your problem as well. It's everyone's problem. And then the second scenario I've got is been given is the Wellington Hockey Stadium, which is owned by the regional sporting organisation and can be booked by users. Again, it's a situation where both the owner and the users have obligations. This might be a little bit different. There might be sometimes, and I'll take it a bit wider, there might be some situations where a club or a team books a facility and the facility owner doesn't have staff on site. Again, I just say this has to be done through communication and consultation between the parties. You can't simply brush it off to the other party and say, no, they're using it, or no, they're owning it. It's their issue. So your plan should incorporate what if we run a facility that we rent out to others? How are we going to manage this? How are they going to manage this? What's fair for each party to do, kind of thing. So unfortunately, there is no one size fits all there. But the takeaway from that is that everyone, owners, users, has obligations and should be working together to make sure that everyone's obligations under that act are fulfilled. Now, look, that ends the presentation that I've got, but there might be some questions coming through on the chat, which I'll just have a look at. Yes, we've got quite a few here.
Richard, do you want me to just start posing questions too? Because I've been keeping an eye on the chat function.
Yeah, go for it, Alison.
Okay. So just some clarification around the rule around gatherings of 100. Is that for both indoor and outdoor sports, and does it include the participants in that 100 number?
Great question. So the 100 or the limit of 100 people applies to both indoor and outdoor sports. They have said specifically when it's an outdoor sport that it does not apply to the participants playing the game. So referees, officials, things like that. They haven't given that exclusion to indoor sports. So yes, it applies to both indoors and outdoors. When you're outdoors, for example, on a field or a court, it excludes the participants. And they have also said that each separate field is 100. So if you've got two fields next to each other, under their guidance, technically both could have 100. But I think we're going to see some more guidance come out regarding that when it comes to shared facilities, because both of those two sets of 100 people will need a bathroom facility. So that is both outdoor and indoor. There's the limit of 100.
Does staggering game times help manage the gathering rule?
Absolutely. That's something each sport will have to work through. But for example, at club rooms where you might, over a course of a normal Saturday, have say 3 fields and six games, or including junior sport, you might have even more. You're going to get well more than 100 through the club rooms. If you staggered game times and had some sort of system in place for sanitising common touch areas, then that would absolutely help, yes.
Could we get managers of teams to complete an online Google form and confirm that this has been done when the team hits the playing field as a way to contact trace? Yes,
I think it's a good example of one way you can contact trace the teams involved. Now, most sports have some sort of, well, a lot of sports have some sort of team sheet in play already. And I haven't actually talked about this. This is good for contact tracing the actual participants. Yes, there should be some sort of requirements for every single game of sports where a team sheet is filled in and sent to the regional sporting organisation club who sends it on. Rugby's got this in place already. I'm sure most or many other sports do as well. But there will need to be, as part of the contact tracing, a register of those actually playing the game. I'm remiss in not mentioning that earlier. So yes, it could be form, it could be a paper form, it could be a text saying our team today was this to the club or to the regional sporting organisation. But yes, each sport will need to have some sort of way of making sure they can say who was playing in the game.
What about contact tracing in the public? So someone has asked, for example, mountain biking at Macra Peak and managing contact tracing when it is possible / likely participants come into contact with strangers?
That's a very good question, and if I knew the answer to that, I think the council would pay a lot of money. You know, it's really a difficult situation where you've got regional parks and say mountain biking tracks that are generally open to the public. It may be that the council implements some sort of register at entry or a self-registration book or document to sign. I think it's going to be very hard to police from that point of view. And it may be that there is no reasonable way of doing it. So that's going to have to be on a specific basis, where the location is and the park and things like that. Yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah, and I think people in public spaces, as the Prime Minister said yesterday, have to adhere to the 2 metre rule, whereas within our homes and offices it's 1 metre. What happens if there is equipment that can't be cleaned, i.e. Gymnastics bars? Do we have to remove those from training or from the floor, or do we ask athletes to sanitise them before and after use?
Good question. So it's not compulsory to remove shared equipment. It is recommended to minimise it. So if it is possible, I would minimise shared equipment. And the next step is, if it's not possible or it's necessary for the sport to continue, then it's sanitised, or the people using it's regularly sanitised. So for an example, uneven gymnastic bars, if it's quite hard to clean that, you might simply just have a hand sanitizer next to the bars that all people using the bars have to do before and after they use it. So again, it's going to be a bit of a planning session for each specific sport to have to think about what they can and can't do.
What is the club room's social distancing rule following a contact sport? So I presume this is once the sport has been played and everyone's back in the club rooms.
Great question. Now, there are generally a lot of strangers in club rooms, also a lot of people that know each other. To be safe, I would say it's 2 metres. But when you look at a club rooms, it follows the guidelines that have been released for a restaurant or a bar. Everyone must be seated. Everyone must be separated, and that means tables are 2 metres apart. If you're with a group of people that are your friends, that's fine. That's the same for restaurants and bars. So that's fine. And then there must be a single server. So you don't go up to the bar and get a beer. People come to you, kind of thing. So that'll be a bit of a change for club rooms, and we'll have to see how they manage that.
And just with the contact tracing, does this also apply keeping records for those that are training, so not playing on game day, but having a training session?
Great question. I haven't seen any guidance to that, but my gut says yes, it would. So for a training, the manager or coach of the team or someone will simply have to take a note of who trains. And generally most trainings are associated to a club. So it would simply be someone from that training notes down everyone who was there and flicks that onto the club. I'd say would be the simplest way of dealing with that.
Lovely. Has there been any recommendations on how often high contact areas such as keyboards, doorknobs, light switches, etc. have to be cleaned?
I'm not aware of any specific timeframes on that. It's a bit of a balancing act. We want to do as much as possible, but then from a practical point of view, it's not realistic to do it every 10 minutes. So no, unfortunately, I don't have an answer for that. Have a think about what's reasonable and what you could do, and go from there. Hopefully, we'll get guidance on that soon.
And one question just around the Health and Safety Act, which you've covered. What are the implications for people or organisations, sporting organisations, that may not follow the guidelines or be seen to be doing what is necessary and practical?
Great question. So there'd be a number of possible implications, and it would really depend on the situation. But firstly, one is the publicity side of things. Going to look good for that organisation or that club or whoever is breaching guidelines. And given the current situation, that kind of story would be very media friendly, as in the media would love to report on something like that. So the reputation issue first and foremost. Second to that is, we all want sports to continue, and if some sports or some organisations aren't following the rules, I feel as though they would be jeopardising that ability to play sport for their specific sport or club or facility or whatever it is. And then thirdly, from a legal point of view, if you're breaching your obligations to the Health and Safety Act, Work Act, WorkSafe can investigate and can prosecute.
Thanks, Richard. That looks like all the questions that I have seen come through.
Okay, so just in summary from me, I think every organisation, every club is going to need a plan. It's all very sport specific and location specific, so there's going to need to be a lot of admin done before we can restart. I know we're all keen to get out there as soon as possible, so the earlier you can work on the plan and the more detailed it is, the better. And just again, as that final proviso, I'm expecting all the national sporting organisations to issue guidance that will flow down through regional sporting organisations and clubs, and that will be sport specific. So this certainly doesn't replace that, but is more of an overview of what we can expect going forward and how to prepare for that.
Thank you so much, Richard, for really such a practical and really informative session. Just seeing through the chat function there with the amount of questions just shows you how relevant this is to right now what we're having to deal with, and the amount of information that you've shared has been immense, and I'm sure recognised by everybody that it has helped. Hence, I think also why we're recording this, and it will be available on our website afterwards. There's so much information, it'll be good to go over it again. But we're really appreciative to yourself, Richard, and to Gibson Sheat for really supporting our sector in this area. It is a complex area, as we said at the beginning, where things are moving all the time. It's all new for everybody, and we really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Yeah, not a problem. Look, if anyone has any further questions, I'm more than happy for you to send me a quick email and we can have a chat about it. If you don't have my email, I think you can just Google me, or someone at Sport Wellington will have it as well.
Yeah, it'll be on our website. And just following up on that, we'll be sending out our e-newsletter tomorrow. It comes out on a Friday. That will have a recording of this session, as we mentioned, but other updates as we go forward. As a follow-up to this session next week, we're planning on having some real-world examples. So again, that will be promoted through our newsletter and on our website. And I think, for us all, the big takeaway is just to be aware of what our responsibility is in familiarising ourselves with the Health and Safety Act, and to think through those scenarios that we can make up these plans so that we can mitigate any sort of issues that may come forward as we slowly get back into sport. And finally, I think it is the message that the government is saying, just play it safe. We don't need to be in a hurry. It's better to do things well and do it right than to think we have to get up and running from day one. But thank you, everyone. I hope you found this really informative. And again, Sport Wellington, we're here to try and support you all. So do stay in touch as much as you can. And have a great afternoon. Thank you.